I'm going to ask you some questions about your background. You understand? You're from Baltimore. You grew up in Baltimore. Your family's from Baltimore. You lived in Baltimore your whole life. You're not from the rich part of Baltimore. You're not from the fashionable part of Baltimore. You're from the poor part of Baltimore. You're from the neighborhood that the police don't want to go. You're from the neighborhood where people don't trust the police, where people don't call the police when there's a problem, when people don't expect the police to look out for their best interests. That's where you're from. I want to ask you some questions about your family. You understand? You have a father, you have a mother, and you have your mother's parents. You don't live with your father. You haven't lived with your father for years. Your father hasn't been able to support your family financially for years. He's had problems with drugs, and he's been in prison. He doesn't have a full-time job. He hasn't had a full-time job in years. He doesn't have a part-time job. He hasn't had a part-time job in years. You do live with your mother, and you've lived with your mother your whole life. Your mother doesn't have a full-time job. She doesn't have a part-time job. She hasn't had a full-time job in years. She hasn't had a part-time job in years. You live with your grandfather. He doesn't have a full-time job. He doesn't have a part-time job. He hasn't had a full-time job in years. He hasn't had a part-time job in years. And you also live with your grandmother. She doesn't have a full-time job. She doesn't have a part-time job. She hasn't had a full-time job in years. She hasn't had a part-time job in years. There's one person in your household that does have a job, has a full-time job, has more than one full-time job, has had as many as 3 full-time jobs at a time, and has been working like this for years. That's you. Yours is the only paycheck that's coming into that house every month. Your money is putting food on the table. Your money is keeping the heat on. Your money is keeping the lights on. Your money is keeping the water on. Your money pays for health care. Your money pays for clothes. Your money pays for it all. You're the sole breadwinner in your family. There isn't money coming in from your father, from your mother, from your grandfather, from your grandmother. And there isn't money coming in from extended family. If you can't bring money into that household, it can't survive. There isn't food on the table. There isn't clothes on people's backs. There isn't a life for them. I want to ask you some questions about Stephanie. You understand? Stephanie's your girlfriend. You're in love with Stephanie. You've loved her for years. She's the only serious girlfriend you've ever had. You've gone out with her since 7th grade. And before that, she was going out with Adnan. And we'll talk about Adnan later. I want to ask you some questions about Stephanie's family. You understand? Stephanie's family doesn't live in the same neighborhood as you. They live in a different neighborhood in Baltimore. They live in a better neighborhood in Baltimore. And Stephanie's family's different than yours in a lot of ways. You'll agree with that. Fair to say she's got 2 parents. They both work. They both have full-time jobs. They both have good full-time jobs. And they both had full-time jobs for years. Stephanie has older siblings. You know them. They're all successful, fair to say. You'll agree with me that Stephanie's family, scratch that. You'll agree with me that Stephanie's parents don't want Stephanie with you. They'd want her with someone else. Someone with a different background. Someone more successful. Someone with more of a plan. Someone else. And you don't spend holidays over at Stephanie's house. You don't spend Christmas there, Thanksgiving, or Easter. They'd rather Stephanie be with someone else. They don't want her to marry you. They don't want her to live with you. They don't want her to spend more of her life with you. And Stephanie, she's an impressive girl. She's an athlete. She's a scholar. And she's going off to college in the fall. You're not going off to college in the fall. You don't have a grand plan for your life. And that's a real problem in your relationship with Stephanie. I'm going to ask you some questions about Adnan. You understand? You've known Adnan since 7th grade. You've never been close friends with him. At most, acquaintances. And for a lot of that time, you didn't even hang out with him. Now, Adnan's from another part of town. He's from another neighborhood than you. He's from a better neighborhood than you. You know what the magnet program is. It's a special program at Woodlawn High School for students that are especially gifted. Adnan's in that program. Stephanie's in that program. Heyman Lee was in that program. You've never been in that program. As far as you know, the only time Adnan's come to your neighborhood was when he was with you. And you've never gone to his neighborhood unless you're with him. Adnan doesn't spend holidays at your house, and you don't spend holidays at his house. In fact, you've never been inside his house. You've never met his parents, and Adnan's never met your family. I want to ask you some questions about crime in Baltimore. You understand? Fair to say there's a lot of crime in your neighborhood. There has been for a long time. You grew up around the crime in your neighborhood. You've seen violence. You've seen theft. You've seen robbery. You've seen drug dealing. You've seen a lot. And in your neighborhood, when someone sees that kind of activity, the first thing that's done is not to call the police. You've never called the police when you've seen a crime going on. That's just not how you operate. Someone could be shooting at you and you wouldn't call the police. You know what snitching is. A snitch is someone who tells law enforcement about someone else's criminal wrongdoing. Sometimes the snitch is lying. Sometimes the snitch is telling the truth. Where you're from, snitches are not looked upon kindly. They're not looked upon kindly if they're lying. They're not looked upon kindly if they're telling the truth. Bad things happen to snitches where you're from. They die. They get beat up. They get ostracized. They get hated. You're not a snitch. You've never wanted to be a snitch. That's not how you operate. I'm going to ask you some questions about law enforcement. You understand? You've had some interactions with police over the years. They haven't been positive. You feel like you've been harassed by police. You've been stopped by police. You've been kept out of your house by police in the cold for no reason. That's your experience with police. They're not the people you call when you have a problem. And that attitude is common in your neighborhood. That's how things are there. I'm going to ask you some questions about your work. You understand? In your time in high school till now, you've worked a lot of jobs. You've worked one full-time job, 2 full-time jobs, sometimes 3 full-time jobs at the same time. You've worked at H&M, and you worked at an adult bookstore. Now that adult bookstore sells pornography. Not your ideal job. Not the type of place you'd like to take your family. Not the type of place you'd like to take Stephanie. If it was up to you, you'd work somewhere else. That's not where you want to work at all. And you took that job in late January 1999. And you took it because you needed the money. And you took it because it paid more than other jobs. You worked a night shift there most of the time. Only once or twice did you ever work days. There was more going on at that adult bookstore than just selling pornography. There was sex going on, sex being sold. There was violence. There was criminality. You saw things there you wish you could unsee. You heard things there you wish you could unhear. You smelled things there you wish you could unsmell. You took that job because you needed the money. I'm going to ask you some questions about cars. You understand? Today, as you sit here, you have a car. In late January 1999, you didn't have a car. You'd never had a car. You didn't have a prospect of having a car. You didn't have a motorcycle. You didn't have a moped. You didn't have anything with a motor in it. If you wanted to drive somewhere, you could get a ride with someone. You could borrow someone's car. You could take the bus. That was the only way you could get around. At that time, you had more than one job. And you'll agree with me, you're also selling pot. You've sold pot for a number of years. It's one way that you've made money for your family. Now, you know a lot of people around your neighborhood. You know a lot of people who sell pot. And you also know people who sell pot and have regular jobs. Fair to say, there's nobody you know that sells pot and works more than one full-time job at the same time and doesn't have a car. You didn't have a car because the money you were making went to your family. You know who Coach Brown is. A coach at Woodlawn High School. He had a motorcycle, a Suzuki. He had that Suzuki for sale. You liked the Suzuki. You wanted the Suzuki. But in late January 1999, you couldn't afford the Suzuki. It's for sale for about $3,000. You didn't have $3,000. You didn't have $1,000. You didn't have $500. And you didn't have anybody that was going to give you money to get a car. No one in your family was going to give you money to get a car. Stephanie wasn't going to give you money to get a car. Your very good friend Jen Pusateri wasn't going to give you money to get a car. Adnan wasn't going to give you money to get a car. That money had to come from somewhere else. I'm going to ask you some questions about pagers. You understand? In late 1999, you didn't have a pager. Late January 1999. Scratch that. You were selling pot. You were working more than one full-time job. Fair to say, you don't know anybody selling pot and working more than one full-time job that doesn't have a pager. You didn't have a pager because the money you made went to your family. I'm going to ask you some questions about your contact with the police in connection with this case. You understand? Fair to say, in your life, you've never sought out the attention of police. Whenever possible, you've avoided the attention of the police. And until late January 1999, you didn't have a criminal record. You'd never been to juvenile hall. You'd never been to jail. You've never been to prison. You'd never been arrested. But on January 27th, 1999, that changed. You did have a run-in with the police, and it didn't go well. One moment, Your Honor. You were charged with disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. That's a fancy way of saying that you and the cops went at it. You were driving along, minding your own business, with your very good friend Jen in the car with you. And you were driving, and you see lights in your rearview mirror. You weren't pleased. Said something like, "Aw, snap." And you then heard sirens behind you. Things were getting worse. But you kept driving, and then you heard a voice through the loudspeaker. Police officer told you to pull over. You pulled over. You were in the car. A police officer came to the car. he shined a flashlight in the car, right in your face. He started talking to you. You started talking to him. He raised his voice. You raised your voice. Jen raised her voice. And pretty soon, you were under arrest. You were brought out of the car, put up against the car, and put in handcuffs. And you were taken to the police station and charged. Soon after that, you started working at the adult bookstore, and you had some more interactions with the police. On February 20th, you talked to the police. You were at the bookstore working. They picked you up. You got in their car, closed the door. There was a glass screen separating the front from the back seat. You were sitting in hard seats. You didn't feel safe. You didn't feel secure. You weren't happy about being in that car. You were afraid. And they started talking to you. They started asking you questions. They started asking about the death of Hae Min Lee. They started asking you about what you knew. They started asking you about what you knew about Adnan Syed, about Adnan Syed's involvement in her death. You said you didn't know. You didn't talk. You didn't tell them anything. You didn't know anything. But they kept asking. They kept prodding. And they started threatening you. They started letting you know what could happen to you. What could happen to you if you didn't cooperate. Now, you know from experience what happens to people who don't cooperate with the police. Your father's been in prison. You have family that's been in prison. People in your neighborhood have been in prison. And you know that prison's not a good place to be. And so you sat in that car. You stayed in that car. You didn't feel like you could just leave. And they kept asking questions. The same questions. Questions about the death of Hae Min Lee. Questions about Adnan Syed's involvement. And you didn't have answers. So they talked louder. They talked faster. They kept going. And pretty soon, you arrived at the police station. The detectives in the car came around. They opened your door. By the way, that door was locked on the inside. You couldn't just open that door. They had to open it for you. And they did. And you got out of the car. One cop in front of you. One behind you. And you walked. And you walked into that station. It was a long walk. It was a scary walk. This was midnight. It was dark. You walked into the police station. You walked past a bunch of cops. It was copland. And you walk to a small room, an interrogation room. The type of interrogation room you see on TV. The walls were thick. The doors were thick. You walked into the room. A detective shut the door. You sit down at a table, a small table. The room couldn't have been more than from this end of the courtroom to halfway that way. It was a glorified phone booth. And you're sitting at one end of a very small table, and two detectives at the other end of the table. Two big detectives. You couldn't hear any sound from outside that room. You couldn't tell, being in that room, what time it was. Could have been any time of the day. And they have a pile of documents. And they start asking you more questions. Again and again about what you know. What you know about Hae-Min Lee's death. And what you know about Adnan Syed's involvement. But you didn't tell them anything. Not that time. And they let you go. Till the next day. February 21st. You were at work again. At the adult bookstore. And they came to talk to you again. They came at night. They came in an unmarked car. And they told you to get in the car. They opened the door. You get in the car. And you sit down in a hard seat. There's a glass pane separating you from the front. Doors locked on the inside. You didn't feel safe. You didn't feel happy. You were afraid. You were really afraid. And they started asking you questions. More questions about the death of Hae-Min Lee. About what you knew about the death of Hae-Min Lee. And about Adnan Syed's involvement. Somewhere around that time, they told you that you were showing up on some cell phone records. You were showing up on Adnan Syed's cell phone records. Some of your friends too. Like your very good friend Jen. And as you're driving in that car, they keep questioning you. Sometime around that time, the threats began about maybe you're involved in the death of Hae-Min Lee. And what could happen to a guy who's involved in the death of Hae-Min Lee? You also knew then, in the back of your mind, about the arrest just less than a month earlier. As you're sitting in that car and they're asking questions, you're thinking about the arrest. And they keep going. Again, you get to the police station on February 21st. It's dark. It's cold. The car pulls in. Detective gets out. Opens your door. Your door's locked from the inside. You can't get out on your own. One detective in front. One detective's behind. You walk into the police department. You walk past a bunch of cops to a small interrogation room. A glorified telephone booth. And you sit down at a table. A small table. On the other side, detectives. The same story. They ask you more and more questions about Hae-Min Lee and about Adnan Syed's involvement. And you don't give them up. You don't tell them. Then, on February 22nd, you're working at the adult bookstore. It's night. It's the night shift. And they come again. Unmarked police car? They tell you to come with them. So you do. You don't feel like you have a choice. They open the door. You get in the car. You sit down. Hard seats. Glass pane separating you from them. Door locked on the inside. Questions. They ask you questions. Questions about the death of Hae-Min Lee. Questions about Adnan Syed's involvement. They keep going. And more threats. Threats about what could happen to you if you don't cooperate. That you could be charged with her death. Sometime around then, they mention the death penalty. That you could be charged with the murder and you could get the death penalty. You know about the death penalty. You know that it's something that people could get. You didn't want it. There's a lot more. They keep driving. You get to the police station again. They park. It's dark. It's cold. They come around, open the door, still locked on the inside. One detective in front of you, one detective behind. You walk in, past a bunch of cops, to a small interrogation room, and it starts again. Till the next time, things change. You talk. That was on February 28th. And on February 28th, one moment, Your Honor, I'm going to take a brief break and check my notes. I'm sorry, I did not misspeak. It was February 28th. Excuse me, Your Honor. Thank you for your indulgence. They pick you up again at the adult bookstore. I'm going to scratch that and back up. I'm going to ask you some questions about how your interrogations with the police were being recorded. You understand? We just talked about 3 meetings with the police. And fair to say, there wasn't a tape recorder there. You know what a tape recorder is. There wasn't one there. There wasn't someone jotting down what was said word for word. That didn't happen. They weren't even really taking much in the way of notes. Just a lot of talking. When you arrived at the interrogation on February 28th, there wasn't a tape recorder running. There wasn't someone writing down notes. A tape recorder did start running later, but not at the beginning. Not for 3 hours. They kept asking you questions in those 3 hours. They asked you questions about the death of Hae-Min Lee. They asked you questions about Adnan Syed's involvement. You continued to tell them you didn't know who killed her, and you didn't know anything about Adnan being involved. You even suggested maybe other people who could be involved. Suggested they could look at Dawn. They kept asking the same questions. They kept the threats going and the same questions over and over. And somewhere in that 3 hours, you cracked. You told them what they wanted to hear. You told them that Adnan Syed was involved in Heyman Lee's death. I'm going to ask you some questions about what happened after you did that. You understand? At that time, the tape started running. The tone of the interrogation changed. And I should say, at that February 20th meeting, there were 2 cops there. One was Detective McGillivray. The other was Detective Ritz. There wasn't anyone else in that room other than you. There wasn't anyone else in those rooms during the meetings on February 20th. There wasn't anyone else in that room on the meeting of February 21st. There wasn't anyone else in that room on the meeting of February 22nd. And you'll agree with me that no one else could see what happened in those interrogations other than you and the detectives. We weren't there. There's no recording. We just have to take your word for it and the detective's word for it. I'm going to return to asking you questions about what happened in that February 28th interrogation. You understand? The tape recorder started rolling, and they asked you questions about what happened. These questions were following the story you had told them after you cracked, the story about Adnan Syed's involvement. I'm going to ask you some more questions about what that interrogation room looked like. You understand? On the table, you're on one end, Detective Ritz and McGillivray on the other. They had paper there, a lot of paper there. It had documents, there were records, there were notes. And as they were questioning you, they were looking at those papers. They were noting those papers. They were tapping those papers. And you saw what was on those papers. You read what was on those papers. You used what was on those papers to answer their questions. Fair to say, strike that, scratch it. You've heard what was on the recording from the February 28th interrogation. You've listened to it. And you were at that interrogation. You were the person there. You'll agree with me that a lot of what happened in that interrogation is not captured on that audio recording. It couldn't be captured on the audio recording. They were standing, scratch that. They were across from you the same way that I'm across from you right now. I'm making gestures. You're making gestures. There's nonverbal communication going on. And there certainly was nonverbal communication going on there. They were pointing to things. They were having responses. You were. And nobody who wasn't at that interrogation can understand all that went on. We have to take your word for it, and we have to take their word for it. As this interrogation continued, they asked more questions that followed up what they had asked you in the pre-interview. And they continued to look at paper documents as they went. You continued to look at those documents. They continued to point out things on those documents. You continued to read what they pointed on those documents. And you used those documents to answer their questions. I'm going to ask you some questions about some things that you had to lose in life during these interrogations. You understand? You love Stephanie. You loved Stephanie then. You wanted to spend your life with Stephanie. Stephanie's parents, scratch that. Fair to say, Stephanie's parents thought you were part of the criminal element at Woodlawn High School. They wanted someone different for their daughter. And Stephanie was going to college. And you knew they wanted her to see someone else. You knew that because you and Stephanie talked about it. She told you. And you could tell. If you're in prison, you're going to lose Stephanie. She's not going to hang around for some prisoner to wait to start her life. She's young. She's beautiful. She's smart. It's not going to happen. And you wouldn't want it to happen. You want more for her. If you get locked up, you're losing Stephanie. You love your family. As we talked about, you're the breadwinner in your family. If you're not bringing money in, they're out on the street. You don't want that. You've never wanted it. You do anything to keep your family safe. You break the law to keep your family safe. You cheat to keep your family safe. Sell drugs to keep your family safe. And you lie to keep your family safe. You lie to keep your mom from being kicked out on the street. You lie to keep your grandma from being kicked out on the street. You lie to keep your grandpa from being kicked out on the street. You go to prison, it's over for them. You go to jail, it's over for them. It's over for them even if you're acquitted. Because every day that you're locked up, money isn't going into that household. You don't work, they're not safe. Around the time that you had these interrogations, scratch that. I'm going to ask you some questions about, scratch that. I'm going to ask you some questions about what's happened to you in the criminal justice system since those interrogations with the police. You understand? That January 27th arrest and charge, nothing happened to that. You never spent a night in jail for that. You haven't paid a dime in a fine for that, in restitution for that. It just disappeared. Gone. Haven't heard anything else about it. It's been almost a year. And nothing's going to happen to you because of that. You agree? In this case, you admitted a pretty terrible crime. You said under oath that you covered up Hae-Min Lee's murder, that you knew about it beforehand, and you did nothing. You said here that you did nothing to protect her. And when she died, you've said you helped cover it up. You've never spent a night in jail from that. You haven't spent a minute in jail from that. You haven't paid a dime in restitution for that. You don't have a felony on your record as we sit here today. You haven't lost a job because of this. You haven't lost any income because of this. You're still together with Stephanie. She's here in the court today. You're still living in the same house. Your family has food on the table. Your mom's not out on the street. Your grandparents aren't out on the street. You haven't lost your freedom today. I'm going to ask you some questions about your car. You understand? Today, you have a car. You've had a car for a few months. Back in January 1999, you didn't have a car. You were selling pot in January 1999? You were working 2 full-time jobs in January 1999. You were the sole breadwinner in your family in January 1999. You weren't getting money from Stephanie. You weren't getting money from Stephanie's parents. You weren't getting money from your dad, that's for sure. You weren't getting money from any other family source or friends. And you couldn't afford a car in January 1999. You couldn't afford a motorcycle in January 1999. You couldn't afford anything motorized in January 1999. I'm going to ask you some questions about the work you're doing today. You understand? You're not selling pot anymore. That's in your past. You're working 1 full-time job. You're not working at the adult bookstore anymore. Just 1 full-time job. And you have a car. The full-time job you're working at doesn't pay any better than the adult bookstore. Doesn't pay any better than the other job you're working at. Doesn't pay any better than H&M and clothing. It doesn't pay any better than the pot you were selling. You've got a car. You didn't get money from your family to buy the car. Your dad didn't send you money. Your mom didn't give you money. Your grandma didn't give you money. Your grandfather didn't give you money. None of your family gave you money. You didn't get money from Stephanie's parents. You didn't get money from Stephanie. But you'll agree with me, you got a car. I'm going to ask you some questions about Crime Stoppers. You understand? You know what Crime Stoppers is. Anonymous program to help solve crimes. Anonymous. Person calls in, gives information, stays anonymous, might get a reward. Heyman Lee's disappearance got a lot of attention. Her death, too. It was on TV. It was on the radio. It was in the newspaper. People were talking about it. You were talking about it. Adnan was talking about it. Stephanie was talking about it. Lots of people were talking about it. And there were flyers around. Crime Stoppers flyers. You know Crime Stoppers flyers. Had Heyman Lee's picture. Had her name. Told you you could call in anonymously. And had money. A reward. And you had an idea how much the reward was? It was about $2,000. You didn't have $2,000 in your bank account in late January 1999. You didn't have $200 in your bank account in late January 1999. I want to ask you some questions about Dawn. You understand? Dawn was Heyman Lee's boyfriend. You knew this. Adnan knew this. Stephanie knew this. Their friends knew it. Now, you never met Dawn, but you'd heard about Dawn. Adnan had told you about Dawn. Stephanie had told you about Dawn. And Dawn's a little different than you. He didn't grow up in a neighborhood like you. He's never been to your neighborhood. You didn't go to high school with him. He's not the kind of guy you'd have hung out with in high school. And truth be told, you didn't feel very good about Don. And you talked to Adnan about that feeling. You talked to Stephanie about that feeling. And you talked to other people about that feeling. And that is about what I'm going to do for today, people. Because I think it's been, I don't know how